Hey, welcome to episode 3, probably, of the Coffee and HEMA series with me, JB McKeever. Again, I try and make a point about HEMA within the time it takes to make a coffee in the morning. Today, I want to talk about risk management in thinking about what safety equipment to use and why sort of what I want to talk about with risk management means that the minimum safety kit that I suggest people use for any kind of part of the drill for longsword, which is what I teach, is mask, gloves, gorget. Okay. Um, Risk management is a really boring topic. I hate it, but it's also a really important one. And anybody who's worked for a big organization or had to hire a venue will have done some element of risk management before. But the two things I really want to talk about as part of this is that when we have a risk, and a risk is defined as the chance, not the certainty, the chance that something bad will happen, um, we put controls in place to minimize the risk. And in kind of any risk management framework that you look at, they talk about two kinds of minimization. They talk about minimizing the likelihood of the risk happening, and they talk about the reducing the impact if the risk does occur. So likelihood and impact are the two main key things. And when we're thinking about HEMA and the safety equipment that we're proposing, I think we need to think about both of these, right? And in particular, when we're talking about training, I think impact is the one that we should really focus on first, and then we should think about likelihood. And I particularly want to think about training rather than sparring right now. Okay, so drills in any kind of shape or form, whether they're kind of structured or semi-structured, but training rather than sparring activity. Um, the most important thing to think about first is impact. And the if we think about sort of what is likely to be injured, I think that gives us this framework for impact as we go through. And an injury here is something serious, right? I'm not talking about like a small bruise that will heal and barely hurt you, right? I'm talking about some kind of serious injury. The most serious injury I'm aware of in HEMA was an event that happened kind of over in the States, where an instructor was demonstrating a drill slowly, presumably slowly. I wasn't there, and something happened, and their sword went through the eye socket of the fairly new training partner. I know very little about this. There was a lot of news around it, about the lawsuit that ensued. I've got no idea what controls were in place. I've got no idea what really happened. I wasn't there, right? At the end of the day, this person had a sword through their eye socket and debilitating injuries, on the back of it. So that is kind of the high end of impact that we're talking about really here, even in a sort of a dual format. Other areas that are particularly vulnerable to injury are the throat and the hands, right? And the hands, most of us work with our hands in some way, shape, or form with this. But whether you work at a computer or you're a carpenter or you work in a shop, hands are kind of important, right? And most of us have a day job outside of HEMA. I'm currently not particularly, for reasons not to do with HEMA, not very easily able to use my right hand for work, and it's causing an impact directly, right? And that's just being less able to use it. That's not it being broken or completely unusable or anything like that. So these are, and hands in general, they're very delicate things, right? There are more bones in your hand certainly than there are between the wrist and the shoulder. Probably I don't know how far it goes down, but there's lots of delicate small bones, tendons, etc., and you need a lot of maneuverability to use it. So they're very easy to damage. They're very easy to damage, even with relatively light impacts. And then finally, throat. The common thing I've heard said, I've never checked it, I've tried to check it and failed, but the common thing said is that it takes the same amount of pressure to crush the throat as it does to crush a Coke can. Not particularly hard to crush a Coke can. And I don't know whether that's strictly speaking true, but certainly even with very flexible blades, if someone's not wearing a gorget, they have had very scary incidents where a person essentially gets stabbed in the throat and cannot breathe at least for the first sort of 30 seconds to a minute, even if there's no permanent damage. from a relatively light thrust, and I really wouldn't want to imagine what would happen from a heavy thrust without a gorget with a stiff longsword or something like that, right? So the head, the throat, the hands, right? These are the areas that serious injury is likely to occur at kind of a drilling pace, unless you are drilling like an insane person. If something, a sword accidentally hits an arm or a shoulder or the torso or something like that, it's probably going to hurt, right? If it's kind of too hard, you're not expecting it, it comes out of nowhere and it hits there, it's probably going to hurt, probably going to leave a bruise. It's unlikely to do any kind of permanent injury, unlikely to do any kind of lasting injury like a broken finger that takes 2 months to recover or something like that, right? So the main sources of likely injury: head, throat, hands. Which is why in longsword, the minimum kit that I require for students to use for any kind of partner drill is a fencing mask, a gorget, and gloves. Okay, the gloves do not have to be like tournament level longsword gloves. We often use red dragons, and you can use a steel longsword if you're drilling relatively slowly, but realistic enough pace using those weapons. Sorry, using those protective gear. But it does mean that you are unlikely to get any kind of serious injury from any sort of training activity, right? Someone does something stupid in training, they step forward when they're not supposed to, and thrust themselves on the opponent's sword, or the training partner's sword. Yeah, well, they'll notice it. They won't be happy about it, but at that point, we have minimized the impact of that risk occurring, right? We haven't changed the likelihood, we've minimized the impact, and as a result, we're not worried about the student having to go to hospital or anything like that. It's not going to be the same for every single weapon, right? For instance, small sword, where there's a smaller blade, so puncture wounds are a higher likelihood with that than longsword. But there's also way more flexible and less mass to the blades, so the throat is much less vulnerable. I know most small sword people will go with mask, gloves, and jacket. Of course, the nature of the gloves that you wear is going to be very different depending on the weapon, and that kind of thing. But I would suggest that, especially because a mask, gorget, and gloves are minimally restrictive. That's not unrestrictive, but unlike a full-on jacket or dressing up in tournament gear, they're minimally restrictive. They're relatively cheap to acquire for yourself or for the club. All three of those, if you're going for kind of the cheap end of the scale, you can get for under £100 combined, right? That it's best to sort of start with those. So if you disagree about the particular set, that's fine. But what you should be doing at least is considering what is the likely impact, or what is the worst case scenario impact for the weapon that we're training with, and what is the minimum set of gear we can wear in order to mean that worst case scenario is perishingly unlikely to happen, if at all, because we have reduced the possible impact when a bad thing happens. And if you come up with your own set, stick to it, right? I have this at events quite often, and people come up and I'll say, you need mask, gorget, and gloves, and they'll say, I don't have a gorget. And I say, tough. I'm not willing to teach you under that risk. Find a gorget from somewhere, go buy it from the supplier, borrow it from a friend, but don't do it, right? And everybody should, as an instructor, know exactly what they are comfortable directing in and not directing in. That's it. Have fun. Be safe.